Hi, Charlene. Yeah, I like the rabbi's background too.
Zoom is rolling out some new features that I'm trying out, so just getting used to it. You know, if you give me more buttons to push, then I'm going to play with them. Almost got everything ready. This taking care of letting other people continue to log in. Okay, I can go over on the second monitor.
I am very happy we are doing a chapter. I don't think we've done this before.
We've done a little bit in the past, but it's definitely something that we haven't studied at all recently. Looking through my notes,
it's been a while.
We talked about this, I think, like 8 or 9 years ago, which is it's a bit of a while. All right. Well, that should be enough of our regular time for letting people log in. It is nice to see everybody this morning. So before we get into the Torah text itself, I would love to ask you a great philosophical question. Are people basically good and occasionally do bad things? Or are people basically bad and occasionally do good things? What do you think?
It depends.
Wow, what a perfect Jewish answer. But you'll have to elaborate a little bit.
I mean, you're going to have good people that at times are going to do bad things or evil things. You're going to have evil people that will do good things as a side item. I mean, people make mistakes. They're going to do some evil things without realizing it. Or in, let's say, an example, Hitler, that he was the brains behind the Volkswagen company, which has been a great company. So it depends.
Right. Or the classic example, you know, well, he was good to his dogs. You know, we can definitely see that historically that some people who do outstanding acts of evil can also do occasionally, sometimes accidentally, acts of good. And some people who do outstanding acts of good can occasionally, sometimes even accidentally, sometimes on purpose, do acts that are very bad, what you might even call evil. And that's a bit confusing because we normally like to have black and white situations. And we like our heroes to wear white hats. We like our villains to wear black hats. And we don't want anything to get mixed up. But it also is a problem when people think in those black and white terms, because it implies that the intention of the people is always what's going to matter. That if you are a good person at heart, that you'll do good. And if you're a bad person at heart, that you'll do bad. And Judaism tells us it's not that simple. This is one reason why Judaism doesn't say, just be a good person. It's why Judaism gives us a rather long list of rules and guidance of exactly what it means to be a good person in practice. Because good people can convince themselves to do some pretty rotten things. And the Torah wants to make sure that that doesn't happen, not on accident, and especially not on purpose. So with that and a little bit of a background, we're going to look into chapter 15 to see how the Torah is trying to help good people do good in a situation where most of us would agree good should be done, but oftentimes it doesn't work out as we hope. So chapter 15, we're going to go ahead and start right up at the top with verse 1. Get my YouTube reading voice ready. Oh, hold on a second. I realized what was throwing me off here. I'm looking at this going, there's something wrong. That's because I have learned that I like to have the double column system in order to see both the Hebrew and the English side by side, so that when one is being read, you can check the other one at the same time rather than having them oftentimes scroll off the page. All right. With that in mind, and with somebody running a leaf blower in the background, let's go ahead and get started. Every seventh year, you shall practice remission of debts. We've talked obviously many times in the past about the seventh year, what's called the Shemitah. And that is what we're talking about here specifically, the seventh year, the remission of debts. What does this mean? This shall be the nature of the remission. Every creditor shall remit the due that he claims from his fellow. He shall not dun, or he shall not harass, might be a better phrase in modern English, his fellow or kinsman, for the remission proclaimed is of the Lord. So just as a quick explanation of where that's going, although we'll look into some more detail later, the basic idea here is that if you borrowed $50 from me and the seventh year Shemitah comes around, and that's the shared seventh year, it's not 7 years from when you borrowed, it's the seventh year cycle that happens on an automatic set. So if you borrowed in year number 3, 4 years later, the seventh year is there. If you borrow in year number 6, 1 year later, the seventh year is there. So you borrow $50 from me, the seventh year rolls around one way or another. I am no longer allowed to collect that debt. Right? That debt is now remitted, which is the fancy English word for Shemitah, that is released, meaning that I can no longer claim that debt owed to me. I can't take you to court for non-payment. I cannot collect on that debt. So the Shemitah year comes and it cancels all debts. Everyone's got that basic structure. You can probably guess from those of you that are familiar with our study, it's going to get more complicated than that, but let's make sure we've got the basic to begin with. Verse 3, you may dun, I love that word, the foreigner, but you must remit whatever is due from your kinsman. So this is saying that this idea of releasing of the debts is a uniquely in-nation activity. It is something that is being done specifically for our fellows that are bound within the Brit. But we are allowed to continue to collect on debts from those that are not part of the Brit, not part of the covenant. In this sense, the term nochri always clearly identifies people that are completely foreign to the Jewish community. Now, you may be thinking, well, that's not fair. Stop for just 1 second and realize that most cultures allow people to harass in perpetuity people for a debt, no matter who they are, whether they are part of the local family, clan, or foreigners. Everyone is fair game for the credit collection agency. Judaism is saying that there is not, you're not allowed to have that for your own native people, that's to say the people that are part of the Brit, but you can continue for others. This does not permit exploitation. This does not permit usury. This does not permit abuse or criminal acts in order to collect. It just means that you can still collect a debt from people that are not part of the covenant after the Shemitah year. Okay, does everybody understand so far? All right, because now we're going to get what appears to be, in the modern world, a jarring topic change. There shall be no needy among you, since the Lord your God will bless you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a hereditary portion. All right, so why are we talking about those that are poor when we are just in the middle of talking about financial transactions? And it's because the two are intimately linked in the mind of the capital A author, and would have been intimately linked in the mind of the first, most of the generations after the giving of the Torah. For a very long time, the primary type of debt that a person would get into would be debt from poverty. People were not taking out large capital loans in order to expand their factories or open up new franchise branches or things like that. People would take loans from their neighbor, no banks back then. They would take loans from their neighbor in order to be able to recover from bad harvests or fire that burnt down the house or some other catastrophe. You weren't taking out loans as part of your rising capitalistic endeavors and growing your business or such, you were taking out a loan because you were in trouble. And that hopefully is beginning to see why, will help you see why these two are connected. The remission of the debt is exactly because the person is poor when they took out this loan. That this is poverty legislation. This is not just financial market regulation. And that's why these two pieces are not juxtaposed, but are woven together. You may also notice in verse 4 that if we've just finished talking about giving loans to people within our community, how can you claim that there will be no needy among you? After all, if the loans are only being given due to crop failure, droughts, fires, doesn't that mean there are needy? Because that's who's getting the loan. And yet this verse seems to be saying there won't be any needy. And it gets compounded in verse 5. If only you heed the Lord your God and take care to keep all his instruction that I enjoin upon you this day. For the Lord your God will bless you as he has promised you. You will extend loans to many nations, but require none yourself. You will dominate many nations, but they will not dominate you. So if we go back here to our verse 3, where it talks about there being no needy, we can see that that seems to be conditional upon the blessing that the land receives. Remember, most people were farmers and most loans were for farm preparation. And the land will bless us if we keep the commandments that are being given, if we are keeping the mitzvot, the Torah. And as a result, we will be able to fulfill this superlative promise of verse 6, that we will be able to give loans to many others, but we won't need any ourselves. Okay, and the word dominate for the second half of that verse is a little bit misleading. The phrase mashalta that's being translated here as dominate, you will rule, is probably a better term. Dominate always has a negative connotation in English, at least within 21st century American English. But within the Hebrew, the person who is ruling is the person that's ruling. It just means that you are in a position of security and a position of authority, not in a position that is necessarily negative. All right. So as you can see from 4, 5, and 6, there seems to be a almost one-to-one correlation that if you do right, you won't need loans, that there won't be needy unless you mess up. And that can be problematic. One, it's problematic because we know from the book of Job, specifically, that there are people who suffer but have done nothing to deserve the suffering that they are now dealing with. But more poignantly within this, it would also seem to me that if you are saying that people are only poor because they deserve it, then why am I giving them a break and remitting their debts? Indeed, why would I loan to them in the first place? If somebody is poor, if their crops were washed away by a freak flood, shouldn't I just say, well, that's God getting you for some sin that you must have been doing? I may not know it, or I may even think I do, because people are arrogant like that, but I'm not going to help you because God is giving you your just deserts. It seems, if you are reading this in a very superficial and, dare I say, childish view, that these verses do not work well together. And that is going to be even more important when we get to verse 7. Because verse 7 is going to go back to the idea of helping the poor, which we just kind of implied they're only poor because of their own failings. Hold on. Verse 7. If, however, there is a needy person among you, one of your kinsmen in any of your settlements in the land that the Lord your God is giving you, do not harden your heart and shut your hand against your needy kinsman. Rather, you must open your hand and lend him sufficient for whatever he needs. Beware, lest you harbor the base thought, the 7th year, the year of remission, is approaching, so that you are mean to your needy kinsman and give him nothing. He will cry out to the Lord against you, and you will incur guilt. Give to him readily, and have no regrets when you do so. For in return, the Lord your God will bless you in all your efforts and in all your undertaking. For there will never cease to be needy ones in your land, which is why I command you, open your hand to the poor and needy kinsmen in your land. Okay, so from 7 through 11, we are right back at the top of our chapter with the idea that we are going out of our way to help the poor. Even though we know that there is remission of debts at the 7th year, we are still told to help them, and we are told that they'll always be there, that poor happens. And that's then going to try and, we have to reconcile that a little bit before we go into our specific study with what we have in 4, 5, and 6, where there will be no needy people. And yet in our verse 9, 9 was it? Just a second, hold on. I just lost my place. 11, that we find there will always be needy people. There seemed to be a contradiction. So this isn't going to be the main focus of our topic, but I have to say it every time I come across this to help people understand what the Torah is trying to tell us here is that there will always be poor people because there will always be situations which can create a crisis in the life of any individual. However, there will be more poverty in the whole land because it will be unable to help those that are in need if we violate the commandments and we tear down our own society. So think of it like this. You can say that there will always be fires, but that doesn't mean that there will always be fires burning constantly everywhere. It means that fires will happen from time to time. If the society is prepared for it, they have well-trained and active fire departments, and people have smoke detectors, and you've done everything you can to mitigate fires when they occur, then fires are not going to dominate your society. Fires are not going to be the primary problem or fear that you have. On the other hand, if it is everybody for themselves, if you got a fire that's your problem, the community is not going to help at all, then you're going to find that there will be more fires. If no steps are taken by the society to damp down fires, if they're not following the good guidance and rules that will prevent it, then you end up with fires much more common. This is why if you were alive 100 years ago, fires in a town would have been a constant companion. But thanks to good rules, regulations, and a lot more attention to detail and changes of building code, fires now are not nearly as devastating in most people's residences as they used to be, and they are not nearly as common as they used to be. That's what we're getting here with poverty. If we run our society according to Torah, then even when somebody does have a crisis, we will always be able to help them. We will always be able to lift them out of that poverty very, very rapidly. On the other hand, if we don't follow Torah in all of its ways, then we will spoil the land, as another part of the sabbatical year is the rest of the land, which was the main means of production at the time. And we will also spoil our relationship with each other. And the best way to prevent poverty is to actually know other people, know of their situation, and be able to respond before things become too desperate. All right, so that's just a short digression, but we're going to have to come back to this thread that is woven through our text from verses 1 through 11 of the remission of debts, and the idea that that 7th year could be an issue. Notice that the Torah specifically says in verse 9, beware lest you start thinking in your heart, right? Lest you start saying to yourself, hey, the 7th year is coming up. If the 7th year comes up, then that means I won't get my money back. So maybe I shouldn't loan to the person in need. That inner thought, that inner narrative is what I was going for when we were asking about good people and bad people at the start. These aren't bad people who have this worry. These are rank and file neighbors and community people. It's not a giant bank. It's not the insurance company. These are regular people, and they are looking at the coming of the 7th year as a personal danger, that if they have overlent to people in need, that they will suffer when the 7th year comes and they no longer are able to collect that back. As we said before, most loans were done for helping the poor. It's also why in other parts of the Torah, it's very clear that we are not allowed to charge interest. The loan comes back only for what you gave, so there's no gain from the loan. It's an understandable fear that you would lose what you had loaned this person in need when the 7th year came around. And we're going to try and deal with that fear in our main discussion. But before we go, any questions on this section of Deuteronomy in general? Okay, then let's jump in. Oh, don't need that view, and let's zoom it up a little bit. All right, so now we're going to discuss a new word, a prusbul. A prusbul? Prusbul. That word sounds weird. We'll come back to it, but it's a legal document. And here we see in the Mishnah kind of what it is. It's going to take us a while to get our head around. A prusbul is not canceled, meaning by Shemitah, or the sabbatical release that we were just talking about. This was one of the things instituted by Hillel Hazaken. Hillel Hazaken, Hillel the Elder, is the big Hillel. When people talk about Hillel, or the founder of Beit Hillel, the school of Hillel, this is the guy they're talking about. For when he saw that people were refraining from lending to one another and were transgressing that which is written in the Torah, guard yourself, lest there be in your heart an unfaithful thought, saying, the 7th year, the year of release, has approached, and you will be miserly with your needy brother, and you will not give him. The verse we saw. Hillel then instituted the prusbul. The text of the prusbul is as follows. I hand over to you, so-and-so and so-and-so, the judges in such and such a place, my bonds, so that I may be able to recover any money owed to me from so-and-so at any time I shall desire. And the prusbul was to be signed by the judges or witnesses. So what this seems to be saying, and we're going to take it as we increase our understanding through this. So if you already have a better understanding, I apologize, but we need to build up this because it's a complicated idea. What it seems to be saying is that Hillel created a creative financial instrument, that he created a new procedure whereby a person who had lent money to a debtor could transfer the debt in some way to the court, to the judges, and the court would then be holding the document of debt, the bill, if you will, and that would mean that when the 7th year came round, Shemitah came round, that bill would not get canceled. Instead, the creditor would be allowed to collect it even after the 7th year of release. All right, so we're like I said, we're going to dig on this a little more because there's a lot more to be said about what's going on and how it was built and why it was built. But I want to make sure, does everybody understand the basic idea so far that Hillel is saying we can come up with a way where people can avoid the sabbatical release and still collect a debt even after that 7th year cycle? People okay understanding that? People's reaction to it? Does it seem like a good idea, bad idea?
Does that mean that you don't collect the debt from the debtor? You actually collect, the money is returned to you by a judge. Is that right?
Not exactly. You would still collect the debt. And if the person still refused to pay, it's not like you could sue the court and the court would pay you. The money would still have to come from the debtor. The court is acting as a holder of the debt.
Okay, but
it's an early form of commercial paper. It's a securitization of the debt. Correct?
Well, since I don't know what a securitization of the debt is in the modern world, I only know what prusbul was from 2,000 years ago.
It's a form of guarantee on the debt.
Well, it doesn't.
I'm
not sure about the term guarantee because I'm not a financial legal scholar in the modern world, certainly. But if it means that you're guaranteed to retrieve it, then that's not quite true.
It makes it enforceable when
Yes.
otherwise be unenforceable, but it makes it enforceable.
Yes, it makes it enforceable. Absolutely. So what it's saying is that rather than being canceled at the 7th year, it will still be enforceable after the 7th year. Now, this might feel to many people like a violation of the spirit of the law, because doesn't this mean that a creditor would have at his disposal a means of preventing people from escaping the debt that the Torah said you were supposed to escape? That seems odd. Let's look at, go ahead.
I have a question, but don't both parties have to agree to this?
No.
No, okay, so this is a little different.
Yeah, the creditor is the one who institutes the action.
And does the debtor have to know this going into the debt or not?
Well, people would have known that such things were possible from the time after Hillel instituted it. But going into it prior to that, this was a novel instrument, so to speak. So there would have been at least a few years, maximum 7, where from the time Hillel instituted it to the time of the first release, people would have, or prior to that, people would have entered into it not knowing that this could be created. But are you saying then that people might have entered in as a debtor to a contract on the expectation that they would be released from it by the 7th year, and they never had an intention of paying it? And we should therefore be upset that they are being denied the chance to cheat the creditor.
That becomes problematic.
Well, it becomes, and that's what Hillel is trying to work on here, is that it's problematic in both directions. If you say on the one hand, this violates the spirit of the sabbatical release because it is allowing a debt to be collected even afterwards, we'll see that there are some conditions that we do need to discuss. Then you also have to say, yes, but the only reason it wasn't paid back before the sabbatical release might have been because the person was refusing to pay it, hoping to run out the clock and be able to avoid the debt that they owe and that they should have paid prior to the sabbatical release. So it's easy to have sympathy with the debtor, mostly because in the modern world, most people who are in debt are in debt to faceless institutions that often seem to have unequal legal power at their disposal. But in the ancient world, remember, we are talking at most places here between relatively equal people, not necessarily multi-billionaires and the beggar on the street, but somebody who is very poor, but likely the neighbor or at least community member of the people that are making the loan. So we shouldn't be too quick to side with the poor person as though they are the innocent victim of some corporate machinations that are oppressing them.
Think of the case of the poor landlord who owns 2 apartments, or the poor widow who owns a small triplex that she rents out 2 units for her income, and a tenant, knowing that they can get out of paying their rent because the clock is going to run out. People are hurt by this if their debts aren't being paid.
Exactly. And again, that's what I just want to make sure we keep in mind, that the people who are being hurt on both sides are normal people. That's not an individual versus a corporate entity. These are individuals versus individuals. And you have to be very careful before jumping to a conclusion of who is right or wrong just because of a financial imbalance in this situation. And let's go ahead and take a look a little bit more at some of the teachings on this, and we can get maybe a clearer view of what was happening. So one of the explanations of how this is allowed from Sifrei is, "And whatsoever of yours is with your brother shall your hand release. is the literal reading of verse 3. Let me just show you the wonderful word yad, which many people will remember from their Hebrew school days, yadecha, right? That is in your hand. Here it's being translated as what is due, but it's an idiom in the biblical world of it's in your hand. It means it's within your authority. You have the capacity. So if it's in your hand, you will release. And then they interpret that means, but not one whose hands his bond over to a court. It's not in my hand anymore. Now it's in the court's hands. So therefore, that is not released. Everybody convinced by that argument, right? I don't have a hold of it anymore. The court's got a hold of it. So therefore it doesn't, yeah, it's hard. It's hard. And one of the reasons why you might be feeling a little ambiguous about this, or perhaps even upset at this, antagonistic to it, is, as Rav Krista points out, the word prusbul is Greek. This is a Greek concept, something that we find in Greek courts at the time. It literally means, and please forgive my Greek, before the court. Prosboule, ubuti, is apparently a Greek phrase that was used to do exactly this, to transfer a debt to the court as a form of financial protection for the creditor. So it seems to be a foreign concept. It's even got a foreign name, and it seems to be violating the phrase, the spirit of the sabbatical release. Well, so this is what was the issue, right? That there was a problem, and the problem was exactly the problem that we see in our text. In verse 9, beware, right? Beware of what you think in your heart. The 7th year, the year of remission, is approaching, and now you're not going to help. That in Hillel's day, this was a problem, that people were refusing to loan because they knew that loans could be canceled by the sabbatical year. And as loans were, first and foremost, a means of helping those that were poor, because many people, in fact, I would argue the majority of people in the ancient world did not have the liquid assets to absorb a loss of having made a loan that couldn't be repaid, which is why it's being made as a loan rather than as a gift. That this meant that people were simply unwilling to risk the sabbatical year, removing that necessary part of their own personal wealth from the account books. They simply couldn't afford the loss, or else they would be the one seeking a loan from someone else in order to help them recover from the lost loan to the other person. And this would create a perpetual cycle that people would not be willing to loan. And if people were not willing to loan, well, that doesn't just mean you can't build your new factory. That means those who have had a hard year, who have had a bad situation, can never climb out of that problem. If there are no people willing to loan because everybody's afraid, then no one would be able to recover from a bad health crisis, a bad harvest crisis, or some other tragedy that hit you and your family. And so Hillel needed to do something to get people lending again. Those that remember the financial crisis of 2007, 2008 may remember this was also a big part of government worry around the world of how do we get the banks to start lending again now that they are very skittish, because there are people that need loans. Now, our economy in the modern world is much more dependent upon loans that go to many different things, not only to help those that are poor. In fact, if you're poor, it's less likely that you're going to get the loan that you need. But the basic issue of when people become afraid of lending, it actually hurts everybody in the community. And so Hillel was instituting this to try and overcome this. In fact, this is one of the things that is labeled as tikkun olam in the Talmud. The phrase tikkun olam gets used a lot in modern terms and also in medieval Kabbalistic terms in ways that don't exactly match the way the Talmud uses that term. To say tikkun olam, a repair of the world, doesn't just mean you're being nice, or doesn't just mean that you are helping the world in some ephemeral way. It also meant that the rabbis would institute legislation, regulation, in order to guide people towards better behavior within the Torah's obvious spirit, to guide people towards doing what is right when they were inclined, perhaps occasionally, not to. Again, not because they are greedy or mean or terrible or evil people. This is not about the melodrama with the guy twirling the mustache who's about to foreclose on the farm, unless the widow marries him or something. This is about regular people trying to help each other and feeling paralyzed that they will come into trouble if they do. How do we help them out of it? And Hillel invented this system, borrowed this system from the Greek court, made a few tweaks according to the legal scholars, but basically was inspired by their solution. So let's look a little bit more at how the solution works and why it works and why it's not a violation of Torah. All right, so back in the Talmud. Well, now, is there the possibility that on the basis of the law of the Torah, the seventh year would release a debt, but Hillel then could ordain that such a debt could not be released? Right, so the Talmud is asking incredulously, this is in the Torah. I don't care how much tikkun olam you want to do to try and fix the behavior of your society, but Torah is Torah. How can you do something that cancels Torah? Said Abaye, this referred to the effects of the seventh year at this time. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi says, this is the manner of release by every creditor of that which he has lent his neighbor. It is of two different acts of releases that scripture speaks. One, the release of land, the other, the release of debts. Therefore, since those are linked, when you release the lands, you release debts, and when you do not release lands, you do not release debts. So here what he is saying is that by the Torah's terms, what we would call deoraita in Jewish legal thinking, by the Torah's own terms, then the two types of releasing are connected. And only while you are practicing the release of lands are you also obligated by the Torah to practice the release of the debts. And that was not the case during their generation. Because of the various upheavals and difficulties that we had come through, and because of the shuffling of everyone, the releasing of the land was not then in effect, as it had been in the days of the kings. So, however, the rabbis ordained that the seventh year would continue to release debts as a memorial to the valid seventh year of temple times. So when Hillel saw that people refrained from lending one another money, he ordained the prusbul. So what they are saying is that de Rabbanan, in Jewish legal thinking, meaning according to the rabbis, they said, the Torah may say we don't have to release debts anymore, but we are going to obligate people to still release debts. But having created that continuing obligation as a reminder of the Torah level obligation from past ages, we are also going to put in a caveat, which says that we can do a prusbul, because that means that there is a rabbinic change to a rabbinic prohibition, not a rabbinic change to a Torah prohibition. Make sense? All right, let's just do a little bit more and then we'll analyze this fully. Well then, is there the possibility that on the basis of the law of the Torah, the seventh year would not release a debt, but the rabbis then could ordain that such a debt could be released? Right? Is that really the way you want to work things? If the rabbis are trying to put this in as a memorial, if they're trying to mimic the way the Torah worked, even though it's no longer officially a Torah level commandment, why make it the opposite of what the Torah level commandment was? Said Abaye, it is a case of sit and do nothing. Meaning, what Rabbah said, what a court declares to be ownerless property is indeed ownerless property. For Rav Isaac, Rav Isaac, how on the basis of scripture do we know that what is declared ownerless property by a court is validly treated as ownerless property? Whosoever did not come within 3 days, according to the counsel of the princes and the elders, all his substance should be forfeited, and he himself separated from the congregation of the captivity. So what they are trying to say is, well, the court does actually have the ability to declare something as ownerless, meaning no longer the property of the original owner, in this case, the debtor. And that means that the court can then transfer it to whomsoever they think should receive it. The court has that ability because we can see from the book of Ezra where they made that decision with regards to the way people were misbehaving during the time of Ezra. So the court always has the ability to declare something as no longer the property of the original owners. And by doing so, they then free it up to be moved to someone else. So what they are essentially saying is that the court isn't collecting the debt per se. Instead, the court is declaring the assets of the debtor forfeit and then transferring those assets to the creditor. And that's not the direct repayment of a debt, because they were technically-ish sort of maybe meant to be released, but we're not going to because we don't have to, but we're going to remember it. But we also have this way around it. Instead, it ends up in the right place, but through this detour of court action. All right, I hope I didn't lose everybody with the legalese. I'm trying to keep it very non-technical. But I want you to understand that the court does have that ability, that authority to seize property, essentially, when necessary for the needs of the community. And in this case, the need is to keep people lending in order that those that are in need will be brought out of need by the help of their friends, without jeopardizing or threatening their friends' own financial security. All right, I've either lost you all or explained it perfectly. Either way, we're going to jump to the next page in order to understand a few more caveats on this that are meant to make the whole process seem a little bit clearer, and then reinforce why we're doing this all together. So, going back into the Mishnah, a prusbul is written only for a debt secured by land. But if the debtor has none, then the creditor can give him a title to a share, however small, of his own field. So as we mentioned, the main form of loan was to help those that were farmers to dig themselves out of a hole that had happened because that happens when people are farming. And that meant that the debt was secured by land. And since the debt was secured by land, it puts it in a slightly different category. We're going to explain that with the help of Rabbi Kolp in just a second. But if the debtor had none, meaning the guy owed you money, but he didn't actually own any land, the creditor could officially give him a title to a piece of land that the creditor owned. Basically, I'm going to give you a piece of land that is now considered to be the security for the debt that you owe me, and then you will pay me back because that land is the security. It's a little bit of a loophole, to be sure. Now, why is the ownership of the land the important point here? Well, Rabbi Joshua Kolp, who wrote the commentary on the Mishnah for the conservative movement, all available online. You can find it at Safari. If you see the English commentary on the Mishnah, that's his commentary. It's very, very handy. What he explains is, this is because the lien placed on the land by the debt makes it as if the debt has already been collected by the court at the point of the loan. Therefore, when the creditor goes to collect the loan on behalf of the court through the use of the prusbul, it is as if he is collecting a loan that has already been collected. Thus, this is not a violation of the prohibition of collecting a debt after the 7th year. All right, so let's make sure we got that whole logic down. The loan is secured by land. The land is already there and already has its value, which means technically it is ready to go to pay back that loan. It's almost as though you're just waiting to take the land because you'd rather have the cash. But technically the land is kind of yours already. And since all of this is done before the 7th year, choosing to collect the land or have that paid off by the actual price after the 7th year is kind of just finishing off the business that was technically already done before the 7th year happened. This is why that land part was considered important, important enough that you would willingly give them a small piece of land, literally enough to like grow a stalk of cabbage, in order to have that anchor in the real physical world, to have it as a security for the loan. All right, questions or comments so far?
Rabbi, that's the securitization.
Okay, let's see it. Now I'm learning the modern terms.
It's like with a mortgage, you get money from a bank to buy, but the bank then still has a lien on your property. So they technically own a part of your property, even though you're on the title.
Exactly. Gotcha. Okay. So let's just do a little summary from Mishnah Torah, and then we're going to get down to why this is all so important. And the prusbul is of no available except for the sabbatical of debts in our day, which is of rabbinic origin. But for the sabbatical of the Torah, the prusbul is of no avail. So if we were to go back to the times of the Torah, I mean the early days, or if we go to the days of Mashiach, when the Deoraita, the Torah level of process becomes in force again, then prusbul will no longer be an option. It is a temporary solution in between those two eras, the era of the ancient world when the Torah law was still applicable, and the era of the future world where it becomes applicable once again. So we are not uprooting Torah, we are merely making do with this temporary solution during the needs of our period in between the good old days and the good coming days. But what does that coming look like? What is this all about, right? Well, that is something that we had a hint of in our Torah reading, and from the Talmud, we're hopefully going to tease that out a bit more. Samuel taught, the only difference between this age and the days of the Messiah is Israel's subjugation to the kingdoms of the world alone. As it is said, for the poor shall never cease out of the land. So our verse from 1511, he is using as proof that when Mashiach comes, the world is not going to be raining down bread. The world is not going to radically change in its fundamental natural order, that the world will be different because Israel is not subjected to the subjugation of the kingdoms of the world. We will not be oppressed. And we know that it's not going to be fundamentally different because 1511 told us the poor will never cease out of the land, meaning even in the days of the Messiah, there will still be people that have tragedies and problems that will render them temporarily poor, and then it will be the community's obligation and privilege to be able to help them. Said Rav Chia to his wife on this theme, when a poor person comes, bring him bread quickly, so that others will be quick to give bread to your children. So he says, you know what, if somebody comes and asks, help them right away, because that's what you'd want people to do for our kids. She said to him, you're cursing them. Who goes around saying our kids might end up begging for bread? What a terrible thing to say about your own kids. He said to her, there is a verse of the Torah to that effect because of this thing, right? From Deuteronomy 15:10 that we read, in connection with which there is a Tanaic statement of the household of Rabbi Ishmael, what goes around comes around. So he's not saying that our children will be cursed, but he is saying that society is the kind of way that it is, that it ends up that just because you are financially secure today doesn't mean you're going to end up financially secure tomorrow, unless we all work together to help everybody, and then we know that everybody will be taken care of. As Rabban Gamliel Bar Ribi said, and he shall give you mercy and have compassion on you and multiply you, from Deuteronomy 13. Whoever has mercy on other people will be shown mercy from heaven, and whoever doesn't show mercy to other people won't be shown mercy from heaven. So there is a societal reciprocity of I help you, you help me, and thus we are all fine. there is also a divine reciprocity, meaning that I help you and God helps me. So that way we are also all taken care of. That this is the needs of an individual family or of an individual by himself are not just their needs. These are needs that affect everyone around them, and indeed needs that are being seen by God as well. And our response is being noticed by God. So when we talked about the idea of there could be no poverty and there will always be poverty, it ultimately comes down to how we respond to this situation, that it is in our hands to decide which one of those worlds we're going to live in. And we're just going to finish off with Rav Papa from Bava Metzia. Rav Papa was climbing a ladder. His foot slipped and he nearly fell. He said, if that had happened, I would have been punished like those who violated the sanctity of Shabbat or who worshipped idols, meaning thrown down to the ground. Said Rav Chia bar Rab of Difti to Rav Papa, so maybe a poor man came to you and you did not support him. What a horrible thing to say, right? Maybe you fell because you didn't help the poor enough. That's a horrible thing to say, but also, how do you get from I would have died like an idolater or a Sabbath breaker to maybe you didn't help the poor enough? For it has been taught, whoever turns away from an occasion for an act of charity, of tzedakah, is as though he worshipped an idol. Here it is written, beware that there not be a base thought in your heart, from Deuteronomy 15:9, as we saw, and elsewhere, certain base fellows are gone out, from Deuteronomy 13, talking about idolatry in the community. Just as in the latter case, the sin is idolatry, so in the former, the sin is like idolatry. But because of the similarity of word and structure, we can deduce that since idolatry was being discussed in Deuteronomy 13, that we can also understand that idolatry of a type is being talked about in Deuteronomy 15 with regards to poverty. And ultimately, it is idolatrous to think that we have no obligation to help each other with material needs and with financial problems. It's idolatrous because it implies that first we think that what we have is ours because we made it, which is a wonderful, arrogant human idea that somehow this entire world and whatever share of it we've been able to scrape together is entirely our possession because, there's no God that actually created everything. There's no God that actually made the potential for you to have what you have even a possibility. And it also implies that you don't believe that there is any God that can command, that can say to you, just like the court did on our previous page, you don't get to keep this anymore. It has to go to someone else. You need to share. It is idolatrous to imagine that God has no right to argue that we should release our debts or give in the first place without even entering into a loan to those who are in need. Those that actually believe there is a God and not just idols that they can craft and control. But if you believe in an actual God who has commanded and guided us, then you have to be willing to sometimes enter into the risk of helping others, even knowing that perhaps you won't get everything back, perhaps you will, and perhaps most importantly, we should build a society where it is not often going to be necessary to help people in such risky ways. And that is the ultimate goal. And that is what Torah has called for us to do. Questions or comments?
Rabbi, when I look at this section, I'm informed really by 13:5, which is after Adonai, your God, you are to walk. And this seems to flow from that.
Absolutely. I mean, God has shown constant gifts of tzedakah to the world and to all people. And God has, as Judaism views it, lent the world to us. We are all debtors already to God for what we enjoy. And if God is willing to do that for us, we should be willing to do that for each other. as I talked about in my sermon regarding the Olympics, you know, oftentimes people misunderstand how much those who have succeeded have relied upon others. And it's a real shame when those who succeed forget that themselves. But we are all dependent upon each other for what we have, and we are all dependent upon God for what we have as an entire species. And thus we are expected to be part of that dependency to help others. All right, well, thank you all very much. I always enjoy our study time together. Reminder that we have Mishnah tonight and Pathway to Judaism tomorrow night, and Shabbat services, school starting on Sunday, all sorts of amazing things going on. So please make sure that you're checking out the Temple Israel calendar, and you stay informed. Take care, everyone, and take care of each other.